tradition, our Chavota on Swabhavokti and related alankaras, led by Charlie and H.V. Nagarjano. If you could please send any materials that you still want to send in time for them to be seen by the moderators of that Chavota, please do so tonight if you can. And also those of you who sent materials just to me, please resend them also to Charlie, okay? So without further ado, let me ask, are you starting? So this is a pair presentation by Jennifer Clare and David Shulman, titled Tamil Theory After Dandin, Language, Poetics, and the Nature of Shastra in the 16th Century, Maranalankaram.
Working? Okay. So first of all, thank you all for coming. And I also want to make two additional special thank yous. One to Yael Shear. Yael, are you here? Yael, yeah, who's passing out, who has been extraordinarily helpful in keeping us all organized and cool, calm, and collected. So thank you, Yael. And also I want to give a special thank you to Igal Bronner, without whose vision and stubbornness this would never have happened. I can speak for all of us, all the participants, when I say that the last few months have been really extraordinary, and we are so excited to extend the conversations that we've been having over the last few months to this week with all of you. So thank you, Igal. So then the 16th century Maranalankaram, or the Alankara for Maran, another name for the Vaishnava poet Saint Namavar, begins, like most Tamil Shastra, with an introductory verse, or Payiram in Tamil. In this verse, composed by the commentator Kariratna Kavirayar, who was a student of the author of the Maranalankaram, Tirukurakai Perumal Kavirayar, we are told the story of the composition and the first public recital, the Arangetram, of this text. And I've given you on the booklet that David and I prepared for you. The first example here is we have the English and the Tamil, which in the interest of time I'm not going to read. I'll draw your attention to sections of the Tamil. But I'll read the English. So here's what Kari tells us, here's what the commentator tells us in the introductory verse of the Maranalankaram. So Kari, the commentator, recited the text in a court thronged with noble people, including the text's name, from among the sea of arts which he had learned and taught, presumably from his teacher. In this text, which follows the practice of the two types of usage, and Kari understands these as poetic and customary, or a sort of an elevated everyday speech. This is a common binary in Tamil, between Cheyul and Varaka. The author, in his wisdom, compiled, classified, and expanded on three different classifications of Alankara. One, the Alankaras created by new poets. In the Tamil, this is Buddhamori Pulavar, Punatya Aniyayum. Ani is the Tamil word for Alankara. Along with the Alankaras of the primary text of Dandi, with his ancient language respected by scholars of the three branches of Tamil that are sweeter than nectar. And there we have Amardinam Banchueta Agiya Mume Tamil Teri Pulame Sandror Madikum Mudamori Dandi Mudal Nul Aniordum. Along with many Alankaras created with his own subtle knowledge. This is Tanada Nun Unarval Taru Pala Aniyayum. In the 4 chapters, so he did all this, he compiled, classified, and expanded on these 3 types of alankaras in the 4 chapters of general topics, figures of sense, figures of sound, and miscellany. So there's a lot to be said about this description of Shastraic composition, but I want to highlight a few points that will guide us through our conversation. The first is that the Alankara tradition here is not fixed, right? It can be added to, and in fact, this is a proliferation. The commentator tells us that these new anis that were the basis of the Maranalankaram were taken from poems that were being produced daily. So this is a daily proliferation of new alankaras. And interesting that the commentator interprets the source of these new alankaras not in new Shastra, but in fact in new prayoga, in new poems that were being created. Not in new Shastra, but in prayoga, in new poetry. So here prayoga is the basis for new grammars. And that in fact this proliferation of alankara can have no other source but one's creative mind. And we see that not only here in the Payaram, but also in the commentary on the list of Artha alankaras. The commentator tells us which of the alankaras are in fact the creation. Well, first he identifies those which have primary text outside the Dandi Alankaram, or outside Dandi, which is no problem. And then he also gives us a selection of those alankaras that were created by the author himself with no primary treatise, and that this is not a dosha, but in fact this is something that is acceptable, and in fact a fundamental principle of this alankara. So with this model of Shastra in mind, today David and I will take you through the 16th century Maranalankaram with an eye to what Dandin, to what the Kavyadarsha made possible and or helped articulate in Tamil in the centuries preceding the Maran, and what had changed in the 400 years between the Maranalankaram, the 16th century Maranalankaram, and what we've been calling the Dandin moment in Tamil, which happened 400 or 500 years earlier in the centuries between the 10th and the 12th centuries of the Common Era. So understanding this Dandin moment in Tamil is important because the Maran's understanding of Alankara is mediated through this earlier Dandin moment, and primarily through the 12th century Dandi Alankaram and the examples of the Dandi Alankaram. And the Dandi Alankaram and the Maranalankaram are in fact the only two extant texts in Tamil that deal exclusively with Alankara. Alankara shows up, the discussion of Alankara shows up in many texts throughout the Tamil tradition, but as part of larger discussions of literature and literary language. And it's only in these two that we find an exclusive focus on Alankara. And we also have a text, the Anil, that shows up in references to it shows up in commentary, but we don't have the entire text. So these are the only two that we have. I should say the only two that we have prior to the 19th century, and then there's a shift that we may get to at the end. The Maranalankaram follows the structure of the Dandi Alankaram, which itself follows the Kavyadarsha in 3 chapters, although the Maran includes a 4th chapter on miscellany, Echam, into which it places the discussion of dosha, and it also adds this, or the commentary also adds this extended introductory verse on the greater world of the production and the consumption of Tamil scholarship, including discussions of what makes a good teacher, a bad teacher, a good student, a bad student. And for those of you who have read the extended invocatory verse to the Nannul, many of the same topics are covered. And in fact, we know that the commentator, Kariratna, was familiar with the Nannul. The names of the alankaras in the Maranalankaram consistently reflect the Dandi Alankaram, names, which means that when given the option of a Tadbhava or a Tamil equivalent, the Maran follows the Dandi Alankaram in contrast to the choice, for instance, made in the Viratolium or in later Alankara texts. And what's interesting is that in contrast to what we see in the Singhala, which you'll hear about later this week, and also in contrast to the 20th century editorial practice, the Kariratna, the old commentary on the Maranalankaram does not go back to Kavyadarsha in its understanding, interpretation of these verses. So we don't get, for instance, an equivalent. We don't get we're not told the Sanskrit equivalent in the commentary. Again, in contrast to what we'll see in later Alankara Shastra. So the Maran reflects not just the structure and the terminology, but also the larger aesthetic shift that the 12th century Dandi Alankara marks in Tamil literary culture since the earliest corpus of Tamil literature. And most of you know that Tamil has a long history of poetic production that precedes Dandin and the Dandi Alankaram. It also has an early text on poetics, which was probably a composite text, so it's a difficult text to date, but it has its own poetic system that is that certainly borrows from many Sanskrit traditions, but also has sections that are distinct. But what we see in what we've been talking about, this Dandin moment of the 10th to 12th centuries, which includes not only the Dandi Alankaram, but also texts like the Viracholium commentary, the Yapanankala Virati. We see this moment that is very, very different in kind from the early poetics, although it does retain certain concepts. It's very different, and this moment is defined in part by the recognition of a new treatment of sound and sense in both poetic praxis and theory. And in short, the poetic tradition that's exemplified by these texts is marked by an interest in the estrangement of sound, sense, and the relationship between the two. This phenomenon is marked by an exuberant use of alliteration, in contrast to what we see in the earlier Sangam, earlier Tamil tradition. An interest in twisted syntax that resembles what we might see in the Vyutkranta or Apakrama Vyutkranta Prahelika examples in the Kavyadarsha, or the Aparakrama examples in the Kavyadarsha. We see that this twisted syntax, these examples that use twisted syntax, we see an interest in yamaka, in fact, not just as an alankara, but actually as a component of meter. And a self-conscious play with the literary conventions, but above all, this interest in sound, and in a kind of this kind of artificiality of sound that constantly forces the reader to be aware of the structure of the verse in a way that is very different from the earlier poems. And I'm rushing through this. I mean, we're trying to get to the 16th century, but it's because it's impossible to understand the 16th century without an understanding of this earlier tradition, this earlier change, a change that has not been documented in Tamil literary histories. It's important to give a little bit of background. So the two main results of this heightened, the twofold related results of this sort of aesthetic change. The first is a heightened awareness of the simultaneous dependence and independence of sound and sense. So there's an interest in resegmentation, an interest in the way in which new poems can be produced from the syllables of existing verses. Again, that this use of alliteration, such that the sounds in one part of a poem are sort of, explicitly linked to other sections of the poem, regardless of a clear semantic relationship. So it creates a different kind of samanya, a different kind of relationships between sections of the poem. And actually, Jean-Luc and I were just talking at lunch, this idea that sound can operate distinct from, or operate independently from sense is an idea, a development of this period that we see not only in Alankara texts or texts on meter that deal with literary language, but also in a whole branch of grammatical texts that actually deal with the magical power of syllables, irrespective of meaning, and the interest in curse poetry and in blessing poetry runs throughout the texts of this time, including this whole new branch of grammars. Not surprisingly, yamaka gets a lot of attention here, as does Chitrakavya, which is understood in Tamil to be hidden poetry of hidden meanings, and a related principle is that literature is reconstrued as something that is distinct from other forms of language in its being crooked, distorted. This is a kind of vakrokti moment that, again, we don't see in the earlier Tamil tradition. In fact, we can see this vakrokti, this moment of an interest in vakrokti, as distinct from the primary or one primary characteristic of the early poems, which was, and for those of you who are familiar, you know that they're based in these extended naturalistic descriptions that we might call a kind of svabhavokti in contrast to the poetry of this time. So, and perhaps, and for those of you who are familiar with Tamil poetics, this is also in contrast to the primary role that Varaka, that this elevated everyday usage plays in the early poetics. Something big has happened in Tamil poetics and in Tamil literary culture that again is undocumented in Tamil literary history and made possible in part by the introduction of the kind of treatment of literary language that we see in the Kavya Darsha. So this is a painfully brief introduction, and hopefully we'll have more opportunity to discuss the Tamil Dandin moment in the Chapguta and beyond. This is the tradition that the Maranalankaram has inherited 400 years later. And keep in mind, there were no extant Alankara texts produced between the Dandi Alankaram and the Maran. In fact, the tradition is busy with the commentaries on the Tolkappiyam are produced at this time, but the tradition is busy during this time on producing these grammars of magical syllables. And that's what's happening in this period before the 16th century. And then the Maranalankaram is composed. And you'll see it goes back to the older tradition in interesting ways. So Alankara. So what is the function of Alankara in the modern? So first of all, the Alankara shows up not just in the literary examples, but in fact the Shastra itself is subject to this literary aesthetic. The sutras contain alliteration, the same kind of rules of alliteration or the principles of alliteration that we would see in verse. About 1/3 of the extended the introductory verse, is in fact deals with similes about good and bad teachers, good and bad students. These similes are there in the Nanu, but the modern Payadam expands them, so that again we have 1/3 of the Payadam deals with Upama. So bad teachers are compared to flowers without fragrance, as well as the jewel inside a snake's mouth, and that the snake keeps it for itself alone and does not share it with people who want it and need it. So I mean. The first 2 lines of the invocatory verse of the Sirupapayam are in fact a type of Chitrakavya. They can be reassembled into a new verse. So again, I mean, this is this interest in hidden meaning extends not only to poetic practice, but to the creation of Shastra itself, of Shastric discourse. Let's see. The Maranalankaram includes all but one of Dandi's of the 35 Arthalankaras discussed by the Dandi Alankaram, interestingly leaving out Shukshma. And don't have a good explanation for this, but Shukshma is left out, but adds an additional 31, including several that the commentator identifies as taken from the Tolkappiyam, the early text on poetics, and several that the author coins himself with no source text. And what's interesting here is, with the exception of these 3 that are identified with the Tolkappiyam, no other source texts, either literary or Shastraic, are mentioned either by the modern or by the commentator in this section. So we don't get we don't get any sense of where these other alankaras may have come from. They're referred to only in the commentary as other scholars say, or other scholars mention these types of alankaras. So we know that they were floating around, but we don't know where he's getting them from. So let's see. So I've given you 2 examples here of specific alankaras that are discussed by the Kavya Darsha, the Dandi Alankaram, and Maran. The first one is objection based on a command in Dandi and Maran. This is Taleme Vilakku. Kavya Darsha, this is Parabut Akshepa. Let's see, this is the 3rd section of your handout on page 2. And you'll see here that so the Dundee example here is similar in many ways to the Kavya Darsha. We have so the Dundee reads the kind of wealth that is absent from a false path. That's sort of a strange phrase, will give rise to your greatness. It doesn't cause my life any suffering, even though going down that path is not cruel at all, and in fact that sweet path is beautiful. Don't go seeking wealth. So this is the Alankara in which the heroine or the friend of the heroine is telling the hero that the path is okay. It's not going to cause me any trouble, and in fact it's a beautiful path. It's safe as we see in the Kavya Darsha, and yet don't go. Right? At the end, we get the command, and so let's see. I want to make sure. I started at 2:30. Yeah, okay, I'll wrap this up. So the modern, so in the modern example, when we come to the modern example, we can see here what the modern Alankaram clearly takes from the aesthetics of the Dundee Alankaram, and then we also see where the modern departs, which will set us up for the second half of this talk. So the modern example is as follows. Man from Tirupur, where compassionate Mal Vishnu dances on the neck of the snake. Though you have already learned by concentrating on texts that don't hide the truth about the impermanence perceptible on the earth surrounded by sea, go away and study more. Her suffering, your preeminence, will rise high. And in the last line here, which in the Tamil is Pararamer Param. This is a slasha in which it can be read either as her suffering will rise, right, or in which case the command is negated in the last line, or it can mean that your greatness will rise. So a couple of notes about this example. So first, we see the treatment of language that I made reference to, the role of sound here. I mean, if you see the yamaka, you see the last line, the repetition of syllables. We also have the echoing of this in the third in line C with the bidarmer, the neck of the neck of the snake. And there's a lot more to say, but I want to make sure that David also has time. But the major difference between the modern example and the example in the Dundee Alankaram is, of course, in the first line where we have the introduction of Vishnu. And so the examples that make up the examples that are associated with every sutra in the modern Alankaram are taken from a variety of sources throughout the Tamil literary tradition, but the majority of them are either explicitly composed by the author of the modern Alankaram, or they are verses that may or may not have been composed by him, but follow this structure of being poems that use that employ Alankaram in the service of praise of Vishnu. And this is praise of Vishnu not in any general sense, but specifically here, the modern Alankaram draws on a form of praise poetry in Tamil called the Kove, which is a long narrative, a 400 stanza genre in which the hero is praised. The hero is praised as part of a sequence of narrative scenarios borrowed from the old tradition, the old Aham tradition of these individual monologues that liken components of the Tamil landscape with the interior world of the characters. So modern in the examples, modern introduces two aspects that differ from the Dundee Alankaram. One is the praise of Vishnu, and again, not just any praise of Vishnu, but praise of Vishnu in this particular mode of the Kovai genre, which David is going to speak more about, which is part of why I'm rushing through it here. So on the one hand, the phrasing on line A of the modern example is very standard for the Kove tradition, in which the hero, the poem is about the surface level. The surface level story is the romance between the hero and the heroine, and that the patron of the poem is in fact embedded into the verse in the figure. So, and we have this here, right? The man, meaning the hero, man from Tiruped, where compassionate Mal dances on the neck of the snake. But in the second example, we can see, this is the example of jadi, of swajadi vyatireka, or jadi vetrame in Tamil. We see, and if you skip to the modern example, we see the god, in this case Namalvar, the poet saint, appearing in a different way. And here we have, not by mantra nor by great medicines discussed in medical books can it be cured. Once he's in your mind, he'll never leave, O girl with dark eyes like curved spears. Such is the love sickness felt by a girl not in Madan's embrace. And here Madan is not in fact part of the Alankara that is used it's not part of the Alankara that is used to enhance our understanding of the hero or the heroine, but in fact he is the hero. He is the one for whom the girl feels lovesick. So with those models in mind, I'm going to give the mic to David, who's going to talk about the author of the Maranalankaram in the larger world of the reintroduction of this older Aham tradition into the world of Alankaras.
Just have to transfer this somehow. The mic working? Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about the other half, or the complementary part of this project of the Maranalankaram. Jennifer's discussed the Alankara work itself, Maranalankaram, which is, she said, clearly continuous in some sense with the Dandin or the Tandi Alankaram tradition in Tamil. But this poet, Tirukurugai Perumal Kavirayar, he also produced another poetic grammar. As Jennifer said, you have to always bear in mind that Tamil has this older tradition of its own poetic grammar, the 5 landscapes and the conventions that go with it, and the phases of love, and the themes that make up love poetry in Old Tamil poetry, Aham or Ahapurul. So this same author, along with the Maranalankaram, he's also produced the book which is called the Maranahapurul. That is to say, a grammar of love poetry in the old Tamil tradition. Okay, again named after Mara, namely Namarvar, the poet saint of this place where he was living, which is Arvar Tirunagari in the very far south of the Tamil country. So here he's produced another grammar, a grammar clearly meant to be complementary. He also has a third work called the Tirupapavinam, which is a kind of introduction to Tamil metrical and prosodical knowledge. And you can see from this that this is a poet-scholar who was trying to produce some kind of synthesis, some integrated vision of the whole of Tamil knowledge insofar as this relates to the production of poetry or literature. So in itself, this is something which is really kind of unusual and also points ahead to what's going to be happening in the 17th century. If we have time, perhaps we'll mention that in the discussion. So there are one or two things that I want you to bear in mind along with this kind of integrative drive. One really important element is that this implies that this poet is in a way breathing new life into the old Aham or Ahapurul tradition. He hasn't done this out of a vacuum. We have an earlier Aham grammar, probably from the 13th century, usually called the Nambi Ahapurul or the Ahapurul Vilakam, and he's in some ways dependent upon this, although he's also invented various new elements in the traditional Aham grammar, some of them quite unusual and interesting. I don't have time to go into that here, but nonetheless we have the fact that he's in a way recreated this tradition, and not only in a theoretical or grammatical sense, but he's also produced poetic works which are in this tradition of the Aham love poetry, However, in the Kovai reorganization of these materials that Jennifer has mentioned. So I'll show you an example of what this actually means in a moment. It actually is not only a question of reviving the tradition per se, he has also revived, also in a theoretical sense, the primary literary technique that serves the ancient love poetry. And I have to try to explain what this means. This is something which is called, in ancient Tamil, it's called Ullurai Uvamam. So if you look on your handout, you'll see this on page 4, I think. I have to try to explain very, very briefly, kind of telegraphic style, what this principle means, because this is actually a principle which he has integrated into the Alankaram work. So along with the traditional Alankaras that he's taken from Dandin, and the Dandin-like style of analysis, he has also put a section, following upon the Upama section, which is devoted to this principle of Ullurai Uvamam. Ullurai Uvamam is an Upama, a simile, which somehow inhabits the inside. Or you could say, if you want to take it from the verb, that is to say, Ullurutal, is a simile which requires a certain contemplation or intense reflection or something like that. I'm going to explain the principle very, very simply. Those of you here who know Tamil, I hope you all have copies of the Tamil portions of this thing. Okay, so those of you who know Tamil, you have some of the earlier materials there. It goes back to the Tolkappiyam, and again, we find references to it in this Nambiyahak Porul that I've mentioned. And you have a definition which our poet, that is to say, Kuruhai Perumal Kavirayar, which he himself offers, a definition of this Ullurai Uvamam. What it really means is something like this. There's an underlying principle, poetic principle, of a kind of radical correspondence between the external, or as it were, objectified domain of reality, especially the objects that exist in the natural landscapes, and the inner or internal worlds of feeling and cognition and perception and fantasy and so on. The idea is that this relationship between what exists outside and what exists inside is not an accidental one, but actually a very close and intrinsic one. So that the two domains, the inner and the outer domains, aham and puram in Tamil, actually echo one another or reflect one another in a rather direct way. So it's enough in this kind of a poetry, it's enough to mention something taken from an external landscape in order to imply something that is going on in the internal life of the hero, the Talaivan, or the hero and the Talaivi, or any of the other dramatis personae of this kind of poetry. So that's very simple and I'm afraid rather primitive introduction to the fundamental principle of ancient Aham poetry. And in order to actually understand what I'm talking about, we're going to have to look at one or two real examples. You'll see how it works. So this is kind of on-the-job training. You've now been introduced to Ullurai Uvamam. Again, I want you to pay attention to the fact that he has integrated this principle, which of course does not exist in the Dandi Alankaram. He's integrated this into his Alankaram work as well. So there's an attempt here to integrate these two parallel tracks. Okay, so far so good. So now I want you to look at what we're going to do is the following. How we're doing on time? We have 10 minutes. 10 minutes is fine. That's more than enough. Be nice if we had 10 hours, but we'll do 10 minutes. Okay, it's going to be a modular, compressed version of this. What we're going to do is we'll read one example taken from this poet's own text. One of his texts is called the Nam Perumal Mummani Kovai. This is a text that is in a particular genre, one of the so-called Sitrilakyam or shorter genres. And it's a Kovai, that is, it follows the pattern that Jennifer described. What that means is that you have a kind of aham poem, a love poem with the landscapes, with the Ullurai technique. And along with that, you have an oblique reference, almost always a kind of indirect, oblique, passing reference to what is called the Patudai Talevan, or the actual true subject of the poem, who is going to be either a hero or a god, a king, somebody like that, usually a god. In this case, it's going to be the god, Vishnu in Arvar Tirunagari. So I'm going to just quickly, I don't have time to read the Tamil, unfortunately. It sounds a lot better in Tamil. We'll read the first example. That's it's number 274 on your handout. I'm going to read it rather quickly, and along with the paraphrase that Kari Ratnam, that is the poet's disciple, has given us to explain it. It's just a short little paraphrase. One characteristic of Ulurai Uvamam is that it is always given to paraphrase. You can paraphrase the actual reference and the meaning of these kind of external allusions, okay? So we'll read this one quickly, and it's a rather simple one. And sorry, just one last thing I have to say before we read it, which is that please notice, Jennifer said this, I want to repeat it. This is the case of a poet scholar who has produced 2 or 3 grammars with many examples, but the examples are keyed to the sutras. In fact, one might say that the real point of this text, at least it seems that way to me, I think I can say to us, the real point of the whole exercise is to produce a grammar that will help the reader make sense of this poet's own poetic production. Okay, so that's important to bear in mind, because it's not always true in the case of the Dandin literature. So here's 274. These are complex verses. This is a relatively simple one. Dark Nelumbo, white Nymphea, white lotus, and cool, perfect Mailai flowers, whose marvelous fragrance carries for miles, line the banks of pools where the male bee gorges himself on honey from the red lotus, fully open and ready. He is insatiable, his heart melting. He finds pleasure even in what's left in worn-out flowers of the thorny shrubs that line the shore with its open spaces that other bees have already sucked dry. Okay. That man who comes from that well-watered village has let go of any tie to those who serve the servants of Lord Ranganatha and the Kaveri River with its clear waves. He stays close to the hearts of people who do harm to their own sweet life, leaving wisdom behind, and he goes the way of the vicious senses, at home in ignorance. He's a mean, small man. Okay. So I'm just going to read what Kari Ratnam gives us by way of paraphrase, this on the assumption that it's not immediately transparent to everybody in the room what he's trying to say. You know? But actually, if you think about it, just read the poem another time or two, you'll understand what he's trying to say, and it's really pretty clear. But anyway, Kari Ratnam, and by the way, notice the critical role of this pupil here who is there to make sense of what his teacher has written. Here's what he says. The idea to be understood by the Ullurai Uvamam is, for this hero of ours, there is no such thing as high women or low women. All of them are quite okay for making love and having pleasure. And he has a few other things to say, and then he says the Nirmulli, that's these thorny shrubs that line the shore. The Nirmulli in the open spaces suggests the courtesan who stands in the open street. The landscape, Marudam, that's the landscape of the delta, where we have a married couple, but the husband, I'm sorry to have to tell you, spends his nights with various courtesans, and usually Marudam landscapes are landscapes of rather intense conflict between the two, between the husband and the wife. So the subject, Paratail Piridal, that is preferring a courtesan to one's wife, and the theme, neighbors blaming his character, you know, or somebody else blaming his character. So think of for a second, just look at the poem. I'll give you like 20 seconds to look at the poem again. Okay, just look at it. You see that bee who gorges himself on honey, and he's insatiable, and he finds pleasure even in what's left in worn-out flowers of the thorny shrubs that line the shore. But they say, so okay, by now you know what Ullurai Uvamam is all about, right? And in case you didn't understand, so Kari Ratnam tells us. But notice, please, that we're in the Kovai framework because we have this oblique reference to Lord Ranganatha, Vishnu in Sri Rangam. So it's a kind of passing reference, but really he's the true subject of this poem, although the poem has its own integrity as a kind of aesthetic statement. This is not an allegorical poem. We are not dealing with allegories here. But there is a reference to Lord Ranganatha, and that makes us into the Kovai because you have this kind of hinge between the what's called the Kilivit Taliban, that is to say the hero of the Aham scenario, and the Patudai Taliban, that is to say the patron or the god. Okay? All right, so that's your introduction to this. So now we're going to read, in the last 5 minutes, do I have 5 minutes? Okay, we're going to read a really complex poem. And by the way, one of the features of this poetry and of this particular poet is that there's a complexity of a new order. I think that this is a complexity on many levels, both on kind of the linguistic technical levels, on the syntax and prosody and things like that, but also on the cognitive conceptual level. And this is something I think very characteristic of Tamil poetry in the 16th century. This is a moment of very radical transition and transformation. So here's a rather typical poetry from the mid-16th century. Again by our same author poet. Okay? Okay, I'll read the poem. A monkey snatches a sweet green mango from the tree whose branches fill the sky and enjoys it. But when the guardians of the cool grove come close, sadly he scampers off to another branch and lingers there, unsatisfied. While menial people, hungry for sour rice gruel, cook it and parcel it out without shame, like flawless cow's milk porridge poured into golden vessels that heals all ills, the sweet pulp of the jackfruit ripening heavy and golden among the jack tree's twisted roots goes to seed and is wasted in your well-watered village. Ur is the Talaivan hero. This is a poem supposedly spoken by his steady, stable mistress, the Kama Kirti, who is a figure in these later Aham scenarios. It's like when people dying to drink up the whole ocean of milk created by Arangan, Lord of Srirangam himself, who is praised to the best of their ability by scholars of subtle understanding who have drunk up the ocean of books. Must be the poet talking about himself. Like such people, when they are served a taste of milk, sweet as ambrosia, in a squat, flat bowl, not even full, coming here and begging for love that's full of pain for the sake of a little pleasure, just won't work. All you have to do is say goodbye to those whores. Okay, so this one I think perhaps a little less transparent. And what I'm going to do very, very rapidly is to take you through the structure of this poem. And you can see now that kind of complexity that I was talking about actually is embodied in a real poem of some power, I think. So it begins with the ulurai. We have the monkey, right? Beginning. Here's this monkey. He snatches a sweet green mango from the tree and he eats it. And then he also hangs around the branch where there are other monkeys maybe waiting, you know. Now let's look down below and we'll see the paraphrase that Kariratnam has given us of this part of it, okay? He says, the speaker is the Kamakirati, this long-term mistress. She's distinguished, of course, from the village courtesan prostitutes. They're of a different order entirely. So he says, you don't go to your noble, she's speaking, of course, the Kamakirti. You don't go to your noble lover's home in the evening, but instead play with the young courtesan, Paratai, from that part of the village, Seri. Since she's a common woman, Bodumahal, other men also hang around her house. So left to your own devices, you leave, though you still keep circling her home. So that's the paraphrase of this initial Ulurai segment. Okay, now go back to the poem. We'll come back to Kariratnam in a second. Back to the poem. After this initial Ulurai sequence, which I hope is clear to you, or relatively clear at least, we get this kind of strange, not entirely clear upama, which is classed here as what is called yenai upamam. That is other kinds of upamam. By that, it seems, I mean, there's a long history to this trend going back to the Tolkappiyam, but it seems that what he means by that is an explicit upama. That is an upama that has a word that says like in it. You know, so we have that word in the text in the verb epa. So there's a long image here about cooking, right? There are menial people cooking because they want this kind of crude and simple sour rice gruel, pulingari. But there's also the notion of this cow's milk kurambi porridge, which is poured into golden vessels, you know. So in case you're wondering how this really makes sense in terms of the other material that we've seen, so let's see what Kariratnam says. I'm going back down to the end of the page. I was expecting you to come, says the Kamakirti to her lover. I was expecting you to come, so I adorned myself, made myself beautiful, but you were late. To assuage my sorrow at this waste of my beauty, you come here and stand at the gate and beg me. For the sake of a little pleasure, I have to suffer much grief in loving you. Your duty is to take leave of that courtesan's house. Now, go back to the poem for a second. So, see what we have that initial ulurai sequence. Then we have this notion of the cooking, which has two elements in it, right? This kind of crude porridge, crude gruel, and then a kind of more prestigious kind of milky porridge served in golden vessels. So what does that actually mean? Well, the ulurai resumes. This is ulurai uvamam number 2, which is really a continuation of the first one. And here we have this notion of the jackfruit, these immense jackfruits. They're ripening among the roots of the jack trees, which in fact happens. But they're becoming overripe and going to seed in the well. This beautiful, rich, juicy fruit is being wasted, and that is exactly what the Kamakirti says to her would-be lover. She says, you know, Kari even says, I got myself ready, I put on golden jewels, it's the golden image like the golden pots, and this is all being wasted. It's going to seed, obviously because the Talaivan hero is not prepared to come and pay attention to her, at least not in the way that she would want. Okay, now there's more to be said about all of that, but we're going to switch into the Kovai section. That is this oblique reference to the Patu Dai Taliban, namely the god. And see how he's produced this and what has happened here. Here again we have another explicit upama with with the marker of the upama. Like. So she says, it's like when people dying to drink up the whole ocean of milk created by Arangan. Milk again, you notice the way the milky image keeps recurring. It's like when these people are served a taste of milk, sweet as ambrosia, in a squat, flat bowl, not even full. So here we are, inside that sequence of the poem in which the true subject of the poem, namely the god, is being mentioned. And if you let your mind sort of wander with us a little bit, you can also see that we have here a kind of infiltration of this piece of the poem by the kind of ulurai technique that we began the poem with. In other words, we have the initial image with the monkey and all of that, and now we have an image of somebody who's hungry. Actually, if you look on after this on what Gopal Iyer has written, he did a beautiful edition of this text. Let's read what he says. He says, the god of Srirangam created the whole ocean of milk, which is why they hunger for it and want to drink all of it, but all they get is a smattering of it in a tiny vessel that is not even full. Like that, it's not right for you to beg from me after creating so much suffering for the sake of a moment's pleasure. You know what you have to do. This is Gopal Iyer. He has taken the ulurai, which is by now shifted into the mode of the Talaivi, the heroine. We began with the Talaivan hero who is scampering around with his fruit that he's found, right? But now we've come to the Talaivi and her complaint, and it's a very powerful complaint. She's ready and ripe and hoping to drink up the whole ocean of milk, and what she's given is a kind of tiny smattering of milk, and that's not enough for her. And so this, you could say this kind of second order ulurai has actually now animated the Kovai sequence, and this is something, I may say so, something quite new in Tamil. Does not appear never with this degree of richness and complexity in the early classical Kovais. The poem then has a chance to end on a kind of moralistic or slightly sentimental note when the Kamakirti says, well, you know what you have to do. You know, all you have to do is say goodbye to those horses. Okay, I'm going to have to stop here. I hope you have some sense of the fact that we have at this moment, we're talking about the mid-16th century in a very small place in the very southern part of the Tamil country, but not, I want to say, very far from Tenkasi. Those who know what I think about Tenkasi know why I mention it. You have a moment of extraordinary complexity in which the materials of the Dandin stream and the materials of the old Ahaporul stream have merged in what actually appears to be a kind of strange, powerful, compounded figuration. And it's only possible because of that compounding. That's one way to tell the story of the afterlife of this Dandin moment in Tamil. Thanks very much.
I feel like I've been served a condensed dose of amrita in a deep bowl that's pungifying also at the same time. One of the excitement of this, one of the main excitements of this group together, I must say, is seeing Tamil literary history actually being rewritten by these two people as we were going along as a kind of a side project. So let me turn the microphone over to them, and
we've got it there. Yeah. Anne, please? Yeah.
Thanks so much both for your papers. This was fabulous. And I've looked at this text just a little bit, and that was a really great explanation. In the 16th century, beyond the content, beyond the references to the Lord of Sri Rangam, do you think that Maran's Sri Vaishnavism is incidental in this bringing together of Aham through Kovai, literature melding with Alankara, or do you think it's incidental, or do you think the fact that he's Vaishnava actually lends him more oriented toward this kind of rethinking of two streams of tradition?
Nice question. Do you want to answer that?
Yeah. Well, you can start.
Okay. All right. Okay. First of all, this is the first Sri Vaishnava Kovai we have. The very first. And it could be that he wrote it with that in mind. That is, that there should be a Sri Vaishnava Kovai, because we have Shaiva Kovais, of course, including the Tiru Kovai. So I don't think it's incidental in any sense. And in fact, I mean, I didn't talk about this, but were we to take the implied meaning a step further, then there are some rather powerful things that are being said here about the God and his relation to the devotee who's actually complaining. The devotee is implicitly saying to the God, I'd like to drink you up. And all I get is this tiny little smattering of it. That's all I ever get. And, there's certainly some sense in which that kind of a perspective fits into this Tengalai. He's very much of a Tengalai Sri Vaishnava, right? We also know the name of his guru, and we know a lot about his formation, relatively a lot. So, yeah, it cannot be incidental. I think this is very much part of a kind of, could call it, if you want to take a big word, or a heavy word, a kind of theological program that is implicit in one way or another in these verses.
So I have two responses to that, and the first is, and I thought I had the citation here, but I don't, is that throughout the text you have references to both Tirumal and Maran as he who should be as he who is decorated with various things, but it also as Alankaram itself, right? And so in the example that he gives for the figure of Bira Ani, or the additional Ani, he says that he goes through a list of the best kind of Alankara for various parts of the body, and then he ends with saying that in fact the bowing at the feet of Maran, this is, for me, what other sweetness is there? How can I talk about any other Ani but this? So that Vishnu and Namavar show up not only in the Kove mode but also in more explicit ways as Alankara itself. But the other comment I wanted to make is just in reference to the relationship between the sort of Vaishnava character of this text and then the earlier. And you're familiar with this, but for those in the audience who are not, the development of this aesthetic that I refer to in the Dandin moment is dominated in large part by texts that are identified with Jaina and Buddhist authors. And also, although it's still unclear what exactly that means that they are Jaina, that they're identified as Jaina and Buddhist, and we've had some discussions about that over the semester. I think it's notable that this is the first sort of the examples in the Dandin Alankaram celebrate Shiva, but this explicit identification of the text, or the celebration of Maran and Tirumal stands in contrast to the earlier tradition. Jean-Luc?
Yeah.
Jean-Luc had his hand up first.
Okay. Andrew, why don't you go ahead and ask, and Jean-Luc will get to you in a second. Yeah.
Well, David, you mentioned this this poet, and is trying to make sense of his own poetic practice in these works. And I was, from parallel examples within the Indian literary tradition at large, it's not obvious why that should be the case. If you think of, say, Jagannath or Hemachandra and people, the relationship between Shastra and Prayoga is not, doesn't always necessarily work that way. And I was wondering if there's a specific motivation, or you think that this is a feature of this kind of post-Dundee Tamil moment.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's talk just about this particular poet. You know, these verses, like the two that I read, but actually if you were to read the Tirupati Kovai, which that's 400 verses that exemplify the other, this Ahaporul work, you know, there's no way that anybody could look at such verses as if they were produced in order to exemplify some rule that had been formulated in a Shastric mode. It's just impossible. And you can see from the two examples that we brought, these are very complex, very expressive, very powerful, sort of thought-provoking poems, you know. So my feeling is that on that level alone, although he also quotes all kinds of other things, and he had an interesting library at his disposal, very interesting. And in particular, there's a relation, the poem that we read, to Kalitohai, which is, you know, sort of supposedly late Sangam, unusual Sangam anthology. Anyway, I think if you look at those poems and take seriously what he's doing, you cannot help but feel that he's offering you and working out for himself some poetic program in which there is a way to talk about and make sense of this kind of poetry. And it's a rather new kind of poetry, you know. So, yeah.
I just want to add that just because I don't know that it was entirely clear from our presentation, is that although the author certainly puts a lot of energy into the Ulure Uvamam poems, and the examples are intoxicating, that there does seem to be a division of labor between the discussion, the examples and the discussions of the other figures in Ulure Uvamam. I mean, the kind of poetic techniques that are at the basis of the examples that I gave you are the norm. I mean, the Ulure Uvamam is only one of 64 figures of sense given by Maranalankaram, and although it's an arresting one, and it's one where the author certainly puts a lot of energy, it stands out. It's different, and the kind of yamaka and shlesha and alliteration that dominates the other examples, we don't see so much in the Ulure Uvamam examples. There's a different aesthetic going on. So just to clarify, I don't know that we have fully clarified the relationship between the Ulure Uvamam and the other 63 figures, but just it's important to keep in mind that it stands out. It's quite different, and it may be different in large part because it is trying to reinvigorate that older tradition that preceded the Dandin moment.
Exactly.
So this is an Arya Vinay. So I have no Arya Vina. I have no idea what the answer is. So it's about. So you know this book. It's the Tamizilagana Peragaradi by T.V. Gopalayil.
Yeah.
So there are some volumes about Ani, and in each volume there are many. It's a dictionary, so there are many entries. And there is one entry which reads. Ulure Yuvamatirkum Ottanikum Ileye Vetrumei. So which means what is the difference between Ulure Yuvamam and Ottani?
Yeah.
And inside this article, the last paragraph, Gopalayir says that a commentary to Maranalankaram says that Dandi, the Tamil Dandi, says that Ulure Yuvamam is the same thing as Ottani.
Right.
And if I translate into Sanskrit correctly, Ottani should be Samasokti.
Yes, right.
So Dandi reinterprets Ulure Uvamam, which is an ancient category which is defined in Agatineyal, where he explains that there are two types of comparison, the Ulure Uvamam and the other Uvamam. And the other Uvamam is explained in a later chapter, which is Uvamaviel. So why does the author of a commentary to Maranalankaram disagree with Dandi and say, no, Ulure Uvamam is a different ornament and not the same as the Samasokti?
Yeah. very nice you picked this out. Go ahead, please.
Well, this was going to be the third part of our presentation. So, I mean, it's a very good question. And in fact, if you look at the section of the Viracholian commentary on Wartani, the example given is an example of ulure uamam. I mean, it's an example in the mode of the older Aham poems. So, I mean, I think that given that there are many sections in the Maranalankaram where categories that were in the Tolkappiyam are again reintroduced and reinvigorated. This is one place where ulure, where he accepts the Masakti, he accepts Wartani. The Wartani examples are going to be in line with the Dandi Alankaram examples, including the use of Anuprasa, etc. And he is going to introduce this other ulure umam in order to, as David said, bring in this other world that he is participating in, which is the world of Achaporol
so I just might, those who want to look at this, you have on your handout on one of the pages 4, I think. And Jean-Luc, you know better than anybody in this room that there was a discussion among the commentators about what this Ulurai Uvamam and Uvamapoli actually is, right? So, some people, I mean, Ilam Puranar says it's when the, how does he have it there, the Upamaya and the Upamana are the same, or the Upamaya has no Upamana, or the Upamana is invented by the poet's imagination. But Perasarya says that actually this Uvamapoli is Ulurai Uvamam, and then he has, his own way of describing it. So you could see how that would, in certain ways, naturally issue into Samasokti. But I think it would be fair to say about this particular text, the Maranalankaram, that he has a program that goes beyond that. In other words, it's a much stronger statement than just identifying Ulurai Uvamam with Ortani, even though there is clearly kind of a relationship there. He needs to have that earlier principle restated, reformulated, and then made more complicated. And especially, again, I mean, we don't have time to go into it, but especially it's made complicated by this use of what I was calling a compounded figuration. When you have some kind of Dandin-like analytical figure being kind of braided into, you could say, the actual Ulurai figure. That's the way this thing seems to work at its height, you might say. That is one implication of this, I suppose. Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
I think we have to stop. I also have a burning question that I'll keep to myself. So thank you very much. And, we have to.
Thank you.